Good morning. Thank you for joining us for Research 411, a talk show focused on sharing best practices and trending research topics delivered by professional staff and prominent UT Dallas researchers from various disciplines. I am Tiffany Willoughby, Research Education Programs and Outreach Manager in the Office of Research. I will moderate today's discussion. Joining me today is Dr. Denise C. Park. Denise C. Park, Distinguished University Chair in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, joined the UT Dallas faculty in 2008. She is the founding director of the Center for Vital Longevity and is presently Director of Research at the center. Professor Park is a pioneer in understanding normal aging and how the mind changes with age. She is particularly interested in determining how cognitively normal adults transition to cognitive frailty as they get older, and in isolating a neural footprint during middle age that predicts who will age well cognitively and who will not. To address these issues, she directs the Dallas Lifespan Brain Study funded by the National Institute on Aging, which has tracked brain behavioral changes in adults of all ages for the past 12 years. She has also developed novel adult learning environments to assess whether challenging new activities can enhance cognitive vitality and delay brain aging. Dr. Park has also conducted extensive research in cultural neuroscience to understand how different environments and social values affect brain and behavior in both old and young adults. Flanking Dr. Denise Park to discuss her research on the very earliest stages of Alzheimer's disease is Dr. Joseph Hennessy, Research Associate at the Center for Vital Longevity. Dr. Park, Joseph, welcome. Can you tell us what sparked your interest in studying cognitive decline in adults as they age?
That's sort of a funny story. My first semester in college, I was 17 years old, and I took Psychology 101. After the first test, the professor asked if he could talk with Denise Cordes after the class, and I thought I was in trouble. And when he talked to me, it was an essay test, and he told me my first semester freshman year, about the first month into school, that I had a real grasp of the field. I loved the class. And he told me, "What do you want to do when you get out of school?" And I told him what I wanted to do, and I wanted to be a social worker. And he said, "You know what? I think you should get a PhD in cognitive psychology." And I thought, what is he talking about? I came from a working class family, and no one had gone to college before. And getting a PhD, it's 1969, and I'm a girl. And who ever heard of a woman getting a PhD in cognitive psychology? So the bottom line is, I told him I couldn't afford it. He said, "No, they'll pay you." He was right. And I got an assistantship after I graduated from college and finished my PhD, and have spent, from my first semester freshman year, I've spent my whole life studying the mind and the brain and how it works. And when I went to start my research career as a professor, I realized the field of aging was untouched. So there was almost nothing known about the aging mind. So I began researching that as a young professor, and I've spent my whole life doing it.
Talk about planting a seed and watching it take root, then flourish, Dr. Park. That's amazing, and thank you for sharing. Can you tell us a little bit about the Dallas Lifespan Brain Study and why it is so important?
I think the Dallas Lifespan Brain Study is important because it's looking at, it integrates brain processes with cognitive processes. So on one hand, you have the brain and its function, its structure, and its pathologies, okay? And then you have cognition, memory, reasoning, speed of processing, things of that sort. And they've largely been two separate fields at the time we initiated this study. And it's one of the biggest and one of the earliest studies to look at how, if you track individual people's brain structure and function through neuroimaging over a 10 or 12 year period, how the changes in the brain relate to changes in their cognition. And why it's important is we're finding that people have different trajectories. You might have an individual who shows very little brain change, And at the same time, they also may show very little cognitive change. They may be very preserved with aging over 12 years. We test the our participants repeatedly. And similarly, we can look at where you stand at the first time you're tested and see if there's differences in your brain that predict that you're going to decline a little bit. So it allows us to create a footprint at, say, time one when we first test them and follow them for 12 years. We can see what brain structures predicted that they would decline cognitively into the future. So it's a way to predict the cognitive future of an older adult.
Very interesting. Dr. Hennessy, is it safe to say that all people have some amyloid depositions?
Actually, not everyone acquires a substantial amount of amyloid beta plaques. Many people, even in their 80s, do not show substantial amounts of amyloid at autopsy. And amyloid beta is kind of interesting because it is predictive of cognitive declines, but the relationship's not one-to-one. So not only do we see that not everyone acquires amyloid beta plaques, but those who do acquire them don't always go on to be cognitively impaired.
Very interesting as well.
I think we forgot to mention that beta amyloid is a substance that accrues on the brain and deposits on the brain. It's a protein, and it's diagnostic. It's a required element for the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. There's another protein called tau that is also needs to be present for a diagnosis. But the important point is that we can actually image how much beta amyloid a person has on their brain and see if that predicts into the future that they're going to show decline.
All right, thank you very much. And does everyone show cognitive decline with age? I mean, can you help define like what is normal and what is not, now that we know that we have those two variables in play?
Well, that's a very good question. So the Dallas Lifespan Brain Study, for example, we would measure various components of the brain. And to make it really simple, let me just say this. Think about your skin as you age. Think about your heart as you age. Think about your lungs. They all show changes, don't they? So it seems very unlikely, if not certain, that your brain's going to show age-related changes, right? So I think there's a couple things about the aging brain and cognition. I think that there is no one that at the age of 80 can perform cognitively like they could at the age of 20 or 25 or 30. At the same time, as Joe mentioned earlier, people age at different rates, so that it's possible that someone could really go on quite a long time and be cognitively intact, but they're still going to show small, subtle signs that probably you wouldn't notice in your everyday life of aging. So that's one kind of brain aging. Some limited decline is quite normal. Then there's another kind of decline that doesn't come from the process of aging, but comes from pathology, like large deposits of amyloid or tau proteins, or damage to the white matter through little microstrokes and things of that sort. And that will add to the process of normal aging. And the two things together, pathology plus the natural aging of the brain, will determine where people are cognitively.
Thank you for the detailed explanation. And can you also speak to maybe some outside factors? You hinted possibly at genetics, and how about environmental factors? What maybe makes one person more prone outside of normal aging to be more susceptible to cognitive decline?
That's a very complex and interesting question, Tiffany. What is the case? Your brain is a precious resource and it should be protected, okay? And there's so many ways you can accrue. I sort of think of a brain as accruing neural insults. Like maybe you banged your head really hard when you were a child. Maybe you played football and banged your head a couple times there. Maybe you've had a lot of surgeries and undergone a lot of anesthesia. That could have maybe have had an effect. Maybe you have the ApoE4 gene. That's a genetic marker that probably about 20% of us have. And if you have that, it doubles your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so there's things from the environment. Let's say you're breathing in bad air. and you live in a very polluted environment, that could affect your lungs, but it could conceivably also affect your brain. So I think there's hundreds of factors that could affect how your brain ages and whether or not it develops pathology. I don't think we understand it as well as we should. But I think the main thing is don't unnecessarily subject your brain to trauma, because it might not be a problem initially, but as you get older and your processes decline, you may need that brain power as you get older, and it would make sense to be as careful about protect your brain as a precious resource, and don't do things that damage your health or that damage your cardiovascular system, because your cardiovascular system is it's pumping blood into your brain, and you need that blood flow in your brain to have a healthy brain.
I like that you spoke to some of the suggestions for keeping your lifestyle healthy. Can you add additional recommendations for those who may need them and have concerns about a family history? Can you offer additional healthy lifestyle suggestions to the audience?
I think we can make suggestions, and I think they're likely correct, but I can't absolutely verify it. If you think about this, every time you learn something, your brain changes, right? And it makes new connections. If you can't make those connections, you can't learn. So all of us can learn, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems to me if you continue learning and continue stimulating your brain, by the act of learning, you're making some kinds of connections and you're changing your brain. So my personal advice is to stay as mentally active as possible and try to do things that challenge you, but not challenge you so much that you don't want to perform the behavior. So let's say you want to learn a new language. If that proves to be boring and too demanding, then don't do it. Do something else. Maybe this isn't a good time to suggest this, but I like to think travel is the optimal, pleasant stimulation for your brain. You're learning new things, you're learning new places, you're having a great time, and it's effortful to travel, but the rewards are great and stimulates the brain, and it's not unpleasant to do. But I think people should find novelty in their life and try to learn new things, be it knitting or other kinds of activities, and art, learning languages, playing the piano. There's just infinite things. Do something that interests you, excites you, and most of all, that is pleasant, so that you keep doing it.
Excellent suggestions. With individuals that do have cognitive decline, can you speak to how it impacts family and society?
Sure. I'll answer it briefly, and then I'll turn this over to Dr. Hennessy. Basically, I think every one of us in our lifetime will be seriously impacted by Alzheimer's disease unless we're able to turn things around and find a way to delay it or cure it. By the time you're 85, about a third of 85-year-olds would be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and it's a very long-term disorder. You can get it very early, but even if you get it in your 60s, you could live to be 75 with Alzheimer's disease. So, and people eventually become completely dependent, and it takes a huge toll, not just on the individual, but the toll almost seems to even be greater on the families associated with the individual, because they need so much help. And it's probably one of the most expensive diseases there is in the country. And every country in the world is suffering from problems with an increasingly aging population, and the cost of treatment, and the lack of the cost of care, and the lack of effective treatments. Joe, you might want to add a little more to that.
Right. Just to add to what Dr. Park said, decline is incredibly costly in the U.S. and abroad. In the U.S., this amounts to over $100 billion a year in direct healthcare costs, and many additional indirect costs, including lost earnings and just the tremendous amount of time that caregivers provide to those who are experiencing these declines.
I can imagine that would be the case, especially if certain family members, due to their cultural values or compassion, they care for the individuals who have cognitive declines. And I can see how that may impact their work life, family life balance in having to care for aging, cognitive declining adults.
Exactly.
I was going to say, and the sad truth is that most of the care for Alzheimer's victims is done by family. Contrary to what most people think, Medicare does not pay for any care in nursing homes or for private care due to dementia. So it's a very, very tough situation, both for the individual who's affected, but possibly even more so for the family. It's a heartbreaking situation and a very difficult, heartbreaking disease for the people around their loved ones.
I concur. Dr. Part, how was the study of normal aging, or how has the study of normal aging helped us understand Alzheimer's disease?
I think the study of normal aging is the bedrock of all research that is trying to solve the problems and cure Alzheimer's disease or stop it in its tracks. We can't understand what abnormal aging is if we don't know what normal is. Do you see? And that's proven to be a very, very difficult issue because there's so many ways that people age, and there's so many individual differences in the diversity of trajectories that individuals experience as they get older. So determining what's normal is a very difficult problem, and it involves trying to really look at and test and get some accurate measurements of people from many different ethnic groups and so forth, and try to accurately characterize an individual relative to their own environment. So for example, one problem is people will often tell someone that they're normal. Let's say a neurologist might say your behaviors, a patient goes in and says they think they're having cognitive decline and they're worried they have Alzheimer's. If it's an above average person, they might score normally on the norms, but they may have declined quite a bit. You see, but they're still above the norms even though they've declined. And similarly, in the other direction, you can have an individual that was not functioning very highly to begin with, or has a poor education or something of that sort, and they could appear to be behaviorally compromised with cognition when, in fact, that's a stable state that they don't have cognitive impairments. So it's a very difficult problem, and that's one of the things we're hoping to resolve with the Dallas Lifespan Brain Study.
Thank you for sharing. As you continue to work with human subjects, what are your biggest concerns?
I think overall, my very biggest concern is, of course, protecting the participant and making sure that their experience in our lab is a positive one. We test people every 4 years in the Dallas Lifespan Brain Study, and every 4 years they come in for 7 separate visits. They get 2 days of testing of cognitive function. They get an MRI. They get an amyloid PET scan. They have to visit a physician at UTSW to be cleared for the imaging, and so on and so forth. So it's a very arduous regimen, and I hope they all learn something from it, and I hope they really find it a positive experience, even though it involves not a lot of discomfort. Most of it's fun and interesting, but 45 minutes to an hour in a brain scanner it's a little uncomfortable, and we really appreciate everything that our participants do. So I think that's probably my main thing, is to make the experience positive. But probably even a higher priority is to protect the data that we collect. And we have many layers of coding, and there is no one in my lab that knows when we see subjects that have a little bit of decline or something like that, the data is so heavily coded that no one in the lab would ever know who that person was without spending a great deal of time trying to put all these different codes together. So we really protect the security of the data that we collected, and it's not available with a name attached to it to anyone, anywhere.
Thank you, Dr. Park. How have collaborative efforts with the Office of Research staff assisted you with your research?
The Office of Research staff have assisted me in innumerable ways. We often, when we submit a proposal, there's clear guidelines that it should be in 2 weeks ahead of time and so forth. And the office has always been very forgiving and very capable of working up to the last minute to get our research funded. Emily Lacey in particular stands out with that. Dr. Pancrazio, the Vice President for the research, has supported our work when we needed a little extra help, and the research office has always been there. And then finally, there's the educational aspects of the research office. Tiffany, you've done a terrific job in putting on programs to keep all of us informed about human subject information. You've put on some great scientific programs, and I do try to contribute to those in return for all the good things you do for us. The office is very professional, and it's really, really come a long way from when I came here 12 years ago.
Thank you for speaking to that, and we enjoy the collaborative partnership that we do have with you, Dr. Park. I have a question in the queue, and it is as follows. Does all cognitive decline mean Alzheimer's, or what's the main difference between Alzheimer's and other cognitive decline diseases?
That's a complicated question. There has to be some, first, as I mentioned earlier, you do see some decline that's normal with aging. It's not precipitous, but you will see changes as people get older in speed of processing and in memory in particular, reasoning and so forth. There's small differences, but they're real. When pathology comes into play, the declines will become more precipitous, so the declines will occur faster. And it's not often easy to tell from an individual's cognitive performance whether it's Alzheimer's, whether it's some other type of pathology, or whether it's normal. And until very recently, it was sort of let's take a wait and see approach. And they might ask the person to come back every 6 months and look at how steep the decline slope is in their cognitive function. And they would also do brain imaging to rule out other disorders. However, in the recent past, a technique was developed that allows us to look at the amyloid and the tau on the aging brain, the two proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease. So we can now do PET scans. We inject a substance that travels to the brain, and the amyloid and the tau proteins bind to that, bind to the ligand that we've injected. And when we use a PET scanner, we can see the burden of tau and amyloid that an individual has. These are not widely used practices. They're very expensive, but I expect they will become mainstream in the not so distant future.
Thank you for your answer, Dr. Park. 2 more questions in the queue at this time. Dr. Park discussed not subjecting your brain to trauma in order to protect it from cognitive decline using the example of football. Can you speak to other examples of trauma? Could emotional trauma be a source of exacerbated cognitive decline?
That's a really good question. There's some evidence that people who are depressed might have higher white matter burden, or they might have different kinds of functional scans. Their brain activity may be different. The main thing I would say is to protect your health and your cardiovascular system. Diabetes can affect the structure of your brain by creating these little tiny strokelets that you might not be even aware of. Smoking can have destructive effects. Any kind of falling or activities that subject you to a lot of physical stress where you might hit your head probably could have an effect. I think the best thing to do is stay healthy and keep blood flowing into your brain through maintaining cardiovascular fitness. If there was one thing I would tell people to do, it would be that. And then second, keep your mind active so that you're forming new connections and you're experiencing complexity and adding to the I don't really want to say brain growth, but maintaining new connections and maintaining the health of your brain.
Thank you, Dr. Park. Once you start to experience cognitive decline, can you take steps to slow or reverse it?
I don't think we really know the answer to that. I think right now I would say we're not sure how to slow or reverse it. That's a very important question. If we could delay the onset or the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease for 5 years, we would cut the disorder in half, because people would essentially probably die of other less expensive diseases and less disturbing diseases if we could extend things, if we could learn how to slow the rate. So I think for me, the most hopeful thing is to lead an active lifestyle, and hopefully that will slow the rate at which your brain ages, and try not to be subjected to stress, and manage your health when you have a health condition like hypertension or diabetes or depression. Act as quickly as you can to correct it, and not allow some of these neural insults to aggregate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Park. Can you tell us a little bit about any research opportunities you or Dr. Hennessy may have for our listeners at the Center for Vital Longevity, a research center at which you founded?
Yes. The Center for Vital Longevity is focused on research to understand how the mind ages and how to support the mind as it ages, so that we can develop techniques for people to maintain a healthy brain and to defer cognitive aging, so to speak. There are 7 investigators, 7 different labs at the center, and if you go to the center's webpage, you would be able to see any opportunities that are available for participation in studies. And I would just Google Center for Vital Longevity. That's the easiest thing to remember. And you'll get to the homepage, and it will have information for the interested listener.
Thank you very much, Dr. Park. I did go ahead and put the link to the Center for Vital Longevity webpage in the Q&A chat for our audience members. Any last minute comments or takeaways you would like to share with the audience before we close out today's show?
I'd like to ask Dr. Hennessy to make a comment or two.
Sure. I think 2 big takeaways is that the effects of aging really vary a lot from person to person in terms of how much decline we see and at what points decline really begins to hit. And the other takeaway, I really liked Dr. Park's points that 2 things we can do to help reduce or partially guard against declines are to keep a healthy body. A healthy body helps promote a healthy mind, and to stay mentally active later in life, doing things that you enjoy.
Sounds perfect, and I think that's the best advice that we could give our audience.
Dr. Park and Dr. Hennessy, thank you for being on our program today to share valuable information with our community. Interested in attending these or another Office of Research event? Registration and so much more can be found at research.utdallas.edu.